and so it's just a technicality. They will all remain at the desk, and they will all be questioned um, at the completion of the testimony. Our panel of witnesses here will begin with Dr. Randy Newcomb. Randy Newcomb is the president and CEO of Humanity United, one of the world's largest private donors in the field of international human rights. Dr. Newman leads the organization's long-term strategy to stop and prevent mass atrocities and modern-day slavery. He is a regular speaker on international human rights issues and has appeared as an expert commentator in the media. Previously, Dr. Newcomb was vice president of the Omidyar Network, a philanthropic investment firm. He was a fellow at the Center for Social Innovation at Stanford University and an International Development Fellow at the University of Bath in England. He holds a doctorate degree from the University of San Francisco and master's degree in development and economics and cross-cultural studies at the University of Bath in England. Our next witness is Mr. Enrico Karish. Mr. Karish, former coordinator for the United Nations Panel on Experts on Sudan. He has served on expert panels of the United Nations Security Council in Somalia, Liberia, DRC, and in Sudan, where he has investigated financial aspects of arms embargo violations, money laundering, and natural resource diversions for conflict funding. He has advised the Central African member states of the ICGLR in their effort to establish effective certification and control mechanisms for their precious and semi-precious metals and their timber resources. Prior to his work in Africa, Mr. Karish worked as an investigative print and TV journalist. Last but certainly no stranger and not least, we have Mr. John Pendergast. Mr. Pendergast is the co-founder of the Enough Project, an initiative here to end genocide and crimes against humanity. During the Clinton administration, Mr. Pendergast was involved in a number of peace processes in Africa while he was director of African Affairs for the National Security Council and special advisor at the Department of State. Mr. Pendergast has also worked for members of Congress, the United Nations, human rights organizations, and think tanks. He has authored 8 books on Africa, including Not on Our Watch, which he co-authored with actor Don Cheadle. With NBA Stars, he co-founded the Darfur Dream Team Sister Schools program, which connects schools in the United States with schools in the Darfurian refugee camps. Mr. Pendergast travels regularly to Africa. He is a visiting professor at the University of San Diego and the American University in Nairobi, and he has done extensive work and continues to do so throughout Africa. Next, we have Mr. Neal Neal. He is a government official. As we indicated, the official meeting will end and we will go into the briefing. But Mr. Neal completed his early education at Comboni College in Khartoum before earning a law degree from the University of Khartoum in the early 80s. He is fluent in both English and Arabic. He was the chief Sudan People's Liberation Movement negotiator during the CPA talks, served in a number of senior positions in the SPLM. He is currently serving as Minister of Sudanese People's Liberation Army's Affairs, basically the Minister of Defense. We'll begin with our first panelist, Dr. Newcomb.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify at this critically important moment for the people of Sudan. Before I begin my remarks, I wanted to ask that my full written statement be made a part of the record, if you wouldn't mind.
Without objection.
I'd also like to bring greetings, Mr. Chairman, from Pam Omidyar. You've met with her several times, and she's disappointed to not be with you today, but was traveling and was not able to make it. But you've been an inspiration to her and to all of our philanthropic work, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let me first commend the committee for holding this hearing. As you know, Mr. Chairman, there's never been a more critical time in Sudan's history than the present. How the parties in Sudan and those in the international community use the next 18 months may make the difference between a hard-won peace or a return to large-scale war. Humanity United, the organization that I run, was founded in 2005 on a simple premise. More than just representing a challenge to peace and security, we believe that egregious forms of violence and injustice, including those taking place in Sudan, threaten the very foundation of our common humanity. As a private and philanthropic organization whose mission is to help end mass atrocities and modern-day slavery, our work on Sudan includes supporting advocacy efforts globally, providing grants to those working to advance peace, as well as engaging in a range of other activities focused on conflict, both inside and outside of Sudan. But as requested by the committee, I will focus my remarks today specifically on how the U.S. can support conflict resolution in Sudan by working with marginalized communities in the country and concentrating on the issues that the various parties within Sudan need to be resolving now at this moment in time. It's clear that the U.S. and international attention is focused on resolving the immediate issues. These issues are important, and yet settling them will address only some parts of the complex mosaic of center-periphery conflict in Sudan. Several high-risk flashpoints will still threaten a return to conflict. Time and energy should be devoted now to identifying such potential flashpoints and to promoting peace-building activities meant to reduce those local tensions which could trigger a wider conflict. Central to these discussions are the transitional areas of southern Kordofan, Blue Nile, and Abyei, the so-called three areas, regions along the north-south border that fought with the Sudan People's Liberation Army during the Civil War. The U.S.-backed 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement contains separate protocols for these fragile and high-risk areas, including establishing a parallel referendum for Abyei and a popular consultation process for the states of southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, both of which will remain in northern Sudan beyond 2011. These processes are meant to allow local communities to express their views on the CPA and to enter into discussions with Khartoum on persisting grievances. While the popular consultations in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile represent a potentially important step toward an inclusive governance arrangement, little has been done to prepare for the consultations thus far. Abyei itself is a microcosm of the issues facing both North and South with regard to the 2011 referendum. Abyei, as you know, sits on large deposits of oil, includes traditional grazing areas for northern pastoralist communities, and was the scene of the most serious post-CPA violence to date. As you know, in May 2008, local tensions fueled by failure to implement the CPA led to violent clashes between government forces from the north and south, leading to widespread destruction and many deaths. I think the Abyei incident underscores the case with which a local conflict could trigger a broader war between north and south, collapsing the CPA altogether, and with it, any hope at all for peace. Work with the local communities in Abyei to prevent precisely this kind of violence has lagged dangerously behind other efforts. As the country that drafted the Abyei Protocol, the United States has a special responsibility here to ensure that agreements for Abyei are not just upheld, but that they are successful. The need for local civil society engagement and empower are also dire in Darfur itself, as you know. As the member of the committee knows all too well, the terrible suffering in Darfur has led to displacement and fragmentation, with millions of Darfuris either in refugee camps in Chad or displaced from their homes. Sudan today boasts more displaced persons than any nation on earth. Efforts to negotiate a Darfur peace deal have left critical local voices out of the process, making consensus among refugees and internally displaced persons outside of any part of that peace process. If we believe that we can achieve peace there, this can only be achieved if we help support and sustain the civil society actors that exist in Darfur and help give them a voice in this critical process. Mr. Chairman, before I conclude, I do want to raise the critical importance of thinking today about the challenges of tomorrow. Working for peace in Sudan must also remain focused on the 2011 referendum. If the choice for Southern independence, I think everybody would agree that all indications suggest that it might lead towards independence, there are a number of issues that demand urgent attention. The risk of conflict, I believe, can be reduced, but in order for peace to prevail, international attention, coordination, and diligence by the United States government is needed on 4 pressing issues. The first, cross-border oil revenue sharing. Southern oil revenues is currently split 50-50 between Khartoum and Juba. Should the South vote for secession, the bulk of the oil would remain in the South, but the pipeline to Port Sudan, the only means for the North to get their oil to market, runs through the North. North-South cooperation in the oil sector will require international support, guarantees, and capacity building in the South. Number 2, cross-border population movements. As mentioned in my previous comments on Abyei, there are populations on both sides of the border whose livelihoods depend on continued cross-border access, either for grazing herds or for trade. Early agreement on continued cross-border access will reduce the likelihood of tensions, local violence, and manipulation by outside forces. Number 3, water rights. Flows through the South before meeting with the Blue Nile at Khartoum and flowing north to Egypt. Regional concerns about the implications of Southern independence for the Nile River Treaty need to be addressed. Such discussions will also require robust international engagement to ensure that neighboring countries are confident in this outcome. And number 4, status of the southern populations in the North. I think one of the most worrying scenarios around the secession of the South is the status of southern populations in the North, estimated to be between 1.5 to 2 million people. Most were displaced during the decades-long Civil War and would be forcefully displaced back to the South or may be subjected to violence. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, these are complex and delicate issues, yet we ignore these issues raised here at the peril of the Sudanese people and all those who care about the advancement of peace. Serious work must commence on these 4 issues right away. I urge each of you to push the administration to address these issues and to make sure that continued congressional oversight is exercised as the 2011 referendum approaches. Thank you again for allowing me to appear today, and I look forward to addressing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Karish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'm particularly gratified by your continuing interest in Darfur, which is unfortunately not matched by much of the world, even in places that talked of little else 2 or 3 years ago. I want to bring you the perspective from the broader community, from the broader international community and the multilateral efforts in bringing peace and security to Darfur. And there, I think it is important to notice that many member states of the UN Security Council that 4 or 5 years ago have advocated and helped to impose certain coercive measures on those who have responsibility for the violence in Darfur are now seem to be backing away to continue to fight back against those who abuse the Darfurians. Increasingly, it looks like the poorly understood and under-enforced UN sanctions are being sold out in favor of mediation, whose success is anyway far from ensured. And that is the core of my concern, which brings me here. I had the honor of serving as the coordinator of the most recent panel of experts on Sudan. For those who don't know, the UN has imposed an arms embargo in 2004. In 2005, it revisited the issue and expanded the embargo in order to affect all the parties, belligerent and the government. And the formulation used was that the embargo is for all the signatories of the Jamena ceasefire agreement. That's in place since 2005. There is that same resolution, 1591, also created a sanction committee and with that, the panel of experts, which acts essentially as the eyes and ears of the Security Council in Darfur and in the region. Another important element of this resolution was that it provided a mandate to the panel to monitor compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law, to report those who violate such laws, to report on those who impede the peace process, constitute a threat to stability in Darfur and the region, and are responsible for offensive military overflights. We have tried to fulfill all these obligations and do this in our most recent report, which I would like, a summary of which I would like to have inserted into your report with your permission, along with the full written testimony.
Without objection.
But I would like to just hit on the most important findings of the report that basically breaks down in 8 areas or categories of abuses that we have found. First, most of the armed actors in Darfur continue to violate the arms embargo. The government of Sudan and the combatants of JEM, Justice and Equality Movement, are the worst offenders. Second, many of the arms and most of the ammunition we find in Darfur originate from China. We have attempted to cooperate with the Chinese government and in some instances even with Chinese manufacturers of these arms in order to assist to obtain their assistance in the tracing of these items to the actual violators of the arms embargo. It's very critical that we get full cooperation. We have gotten far from satisfactory cooperation so far. Without that cooperation, we will not be able to conclusively identify the embargo violators, and we will not be able to help with stopping the violence or the violations of the arms embargo. Third, international humanitarian and human rights laws continue to be abused and not respected. Fourth, too frequently, indiscriminate force, disproportionate and indiscriminate force is applied, which leads to massive killings, injuries, and mass displacement of civilians. This past year, we've seen that in several places. Muajaria was probably the most brutal one. Fifth, the panel has made special efforts to listen to the half of the population that usually is never listened to, which are the women. Every one of the ones we interacted with told us that the biggest and greatest threat to them continues to be sexual and gender-based violence. Sixth, almost all parties to the conflict continue to use child soldiers. Seventh, Darfurians are still illegally and legally detained according to Sudanese law, or arbitrarily arrested or carried out by the National Intelligence and Security Services of the Sudan. The detainees are interrogated and subjected to torture and physical abuse, which includes but is not limited to severe beatings and hitting with hands, fists, and boots, as well as other objects, flogging with rubber hoses, burning with coil heaters and other electric instruments, forced swallowing of extremely hot water, sleep deprivation, and being suspended by ropes in stress positions. These findings are from our direct interactions with such victims. We have medical testimonies as well. After they were released, finally, they obviously needed medical help. 8, while the government of Sudan has been claiming that the Janjaweed are disarmed, and that, of course, again goes back to a resolution 1556 passed in 2004. We see no official accounting for that, and we have, however, in the context of the Muajaria battle, found written evidence, battlefield orders, that instructs an Arab tribe to participate in the actions by the Sudanese government forces. The following acts by the government of Sudan and others have not been met with possibly the necessary counteractions by the international community. The panel of experts had one of its members not being allowed into Sudan. Visa was simply denied by the Sudanese government. Once in Darfur, the panel had difficulties to travel to places it needs to go, for example, where the most grievous violence occurred. Of total of 70 issues raised with the government of Sudan in writing, 55 have been ignored. There is a spin-off effect of the government of Sudan's position. It affects very deeply the international community's deployment. The UN peacekeeping force, UNAMID, is in charge of our security. They denied us security clearance, preventing us for 2.5 months to work in Sudan and Darfur, alleging security issues, but we then found out that there were other issues, pressure from the government of Sudan, the true reasons. We have also the fact that the group of the experts from the Human Rights Council was not extended in November 2007, and the UN rapporteur of the human rights situation in Sudan, Ms. Sima Samar, that post was abolished on demand of the Sudanese government and its political allies at the Human Rights Council. A mandate was replaced with another function, a UN independent expert who has a very narrow mandate that actually allows him only to focus on the Human Rights Forum, which is a joint function, a joint operation by the government and UNAMID. And then, of course, we also see that UNAMID is not able to even maintain and protect its own national Darfurian employees, and we have testimonies of those being abused by the National Intelligence and Security Services. The UN must accept responsibilities for some of these problems. The government has overwhelmed and weakened, the weakened management of UNAMID, and something must be done about this. Back to the work of the panel, we have, since its inception in 2005, submitted close to 100 recommendations, all designed to improve the UN sanctions. None of them, in terms of the substantive proposals, have been taken up by the Security Council. For this particular mandate, we were deliberately coming up with only 3 very narrowly defined recommendations in order to provide something that is conducive to this very fractured Security Council, allowing it maybe that these recommendations be adopted more easily. The first recommendation basically encompasses a reporting obligation that we would like to see imposed on the government of Sudan on essentially the steps that they are required to do anyway, based on the resolutions that have been adopted years ago. One would then be identifying exactly what they are doing in terms of disarming the Janjaweed. The other would be identifying when they want to move their own soldiers and troops into Darfur, which in effect they could if they only would obtain permission from the sanction committee. They've never done that. Finally, we also want to see some kind of progress report in terms of provisions to secure the humanitarian situation in Darfur, and in particular what they are doing to protect the women who suffer now much more since the eviction of the INGOs in March this year. The second recommendation pertains to an idea that's been floating around. It's been supported already by a presidential statement of the Security Council in May, as well as the regional forces. This is about the establishment of a Chad-Sudan joint border monitoring mechanism. Finally, the third one, recommendation, we were trying to close the gap between the international community and globally operating companies, private sector members, who knowingly or unknowingly end up being involved in the problems of Darfur. We need to develop due diligence standards that helps them to understand when to make business and when not to do business with certain parties. We are not there. We need to develop a solution to this. Finally, There is the confidential annex about which I cannot really talk to you here because it's a confidential annex. But anyway, this brief description is that we are trying to list in there those individuals we feel are deserving of targeted sanctions. That is an asset freeze as well as a travel ban. Now, in terms of the reaction in the Security Council, I think it's noteworthy that, of course, you always have opposition when you come in, particularly with a hard-hitting report. It's quite normal that people don't want to discuss recommendations and basically just would like this thing to go away. What is new this time around, however, is that those states who used to be the original sponsors of the UN presence, particularly the arms embargo, and other coercive measures, are not speaking up. At least that's the conclusion you have to take when you look at the public record. We have already the new resolution, 1891, that is basically the response to our report. It is virtually the same as the one from a year ago, which was virtually the same as the one the year before. The lack of adjustment to new emergencies and the inability to stand on the principles previously decided and adopted is sending a very loud signal to the Darfurians. The Security Council and member states, including the United States, are not going to come to help. And I think there is a larger issue here. Imposing sanctions only to fail to enforce them is destructive and counterproductive to the policy goals that motivate the sanctions in the first place. Making such empty threats endangers the lives of those who need protection, and it tends to escalate violence because the perpetrators feel emboldened by the very apparent paralysis of the international community. Failing to enforce sanctions also jeopardizes peacekeepers and other members of the international community who are deployed in the conflict area. It makes a mockery of everyone associated with sanctions, including the US government, whose firm leadership made those sanctions possible in the first place. And of course, we contrast that with the leadership provided in 2004 and 2005. We see, of course, also the need that maybe a policy adjustment has to be made, and that it's good and helpful to have China now more actively participate in the dialogue, in the international dialogue. But I don't think that the fundamental principles that are at the bottom, at the heart of the sanctions can be just disregarded. Sanctions that are not enforced will support not. Sanctions need to be supported by the international community, and then they can also be an integral part and an important part, in fact, of mediation. And I think that is an important element that should be considered in the U.S. policy towards Sudan. If applied properly, UN sanctions, we know that can have a very, very beneficial effect. We've seen it in Angola. I've been involved in Liberia with the financial sanctions against the people around Charles Taylor and Charles Taylor himself. We've done it in the Congo. There is undeniably a positive effect if the sanctions are properly designed and then also properly enforced. And I think the same has come clear. There's a report from OFAC that explains how the sanctions that you are imposing unilaterally have a very good coercive effect. Mr. Chairman, I hope that this testimony helps to maybe illuminate a little bit the role that the U.S. is now playing on the international scene. But I would like to bring this to specifics because I fear very much that the belligerents and the government of Sudan should not be given an opportunity to play sanction enforcement against mediation. And I think that we need to develop very concrete ideas how mediation can be supportive of sanctions. And therefore, I propose that you consider 4 points that the U.S. government could maybe insist on. For example, the full cooperation by the government of Sudan with the sanction monitoring efforts by the coming next panel, including, of course, a timely and an immediate issuance of entry visas. Secondly, that all the parties to the conflict, in particular the government of the Sudan, are pressed that they reply comprehensively and transparently to all the issues that are being raised by the panel. Finally, number 4, that the government of the U.S. is insisting with the government on Sudan to provide safe access to all locations, that the panel must be able to inspect and provide unfettered access. And the 4th proposition is that your government encourages and works much more closely with the government of China to ensure that China too is becoming a full partner in the enforcement of sanctions. By adhering to these benchmarks, the U.S. government can begin to demonstrate that while the world may suffer from Darfur sanction fatigue, it will not surrender the Darfurians in the mediation process. Thank you for your interest, Mr. Chairman, in this problem and the efforts of the panel of experts to provide, hopefully in the future, again, useful information to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive report, and we appreciate the work that you've done on the panel of experts. Mr. Pendergast.
Thank you, Chairman Payne, and I'd like to add my voice to the chorus this morning of praise for you and Congressman Smith, particularly for being such extraordinary upstanders for peace and human rights in the world's forgotten places and for the world's forgotten issues. This moment in Sudan's history requires utter clarity. It is crucial, I think, that we admit, particularly after this morning, that the existing strategy of the United States and the broader international community to end the genocide in Darfur and prevent all-out war in Sudan is failing. And it's time to alter our course of our policy in bold and specific ways in order to avert what could be the deadliest conflagration in Sudan's war-torn post-colonial history. As we all know, two of the principal pillars of the CPA are the elections and the referendum. But it's critical to note that the CPA also calls clearly for conditions that must exist for the holding of a credible election, including, as has been articulated this morning, a new security law to reduce the kind of harassment and intimidation of opposition, media access and freedom of assembly for opposition parties, and then, of course, unrestricted access for the international observation. Not one of these preconditions has been met to date. I think we have to stand up, and particularly this subcommittee has to stand up and say that the emperor is as naked as he ever was in the last 20 years of this ruling party, and blow the whistle now on this deadly charade. Why? Well, I think the risks of ignoring the prerequisites that are called for in the CPA for holding an election and the risks of holding a non-credible election are enormous. Why? Non-credible elections are going to do the following things. They're going to fuel violence and divisions throughout the country, but particularly in the South. And from my time living in southern Sudan in the 1990s and your frequent visits, as you well know, that was the deadliest time in Sudan's history because the ruling party in Khartoum was able to divide and destroy the South, was able to rip the South to pieces using these strategies of pulling opposition figures and arming them and having them attack and create intercommunal conflict. The second thing that non-credible elections will do is to undermine the fundamental aim of the CPA, which is a democratic transformation of the country. You don't start a process out of transforming the country with a non-free and a non-fair election. That sets the trend in the opposite direction. The third thing the non-credible election will do is to disenfranchise millions of Darfuris and fuel further violence there in Darfur as the contest erupts and the divisions that occur will be used by the National Congress Party and others who want to undermine stability and peace in Darfur to further instability. The fourth thing a non-credible election will do is to provide false legitimacy to an indicted war criminal and to the party that he represents. And that's the last thing we need to be doing, and that rolls right into the fifth thing, which is let's not waste tens of millions. I think the number is $96 million of U.S. taxpayers' money underwriting a non-credible election that's going to legitimize that war criminal. Until the parties, so what's the bottom line on this then? Until the parties agree to conditions that are in the CPA that will allow a credible election, I think the United States and the broader international community, the United States has to lead it. We need to suspend all of our electoral assistance, the tens of millions of our taxpayers' dollars that are being spent on this thing. And the non-credible elections simply shouldn't be financed. We need to live by the principle. Non-credible elections shouldn't be financed by the United States taxpayers. And the parties, I think, we should encourage them to agree to delay these elections until the CPA-mandated conditions for free and fair elections for democratic transformation exist, because we can't be party to recognizing the results of any election that doesn't meet basic standards. We've done it too many times around Africa, and this furthers problems and deepens problems rather than resolves them. However, we have to equally vigorously continue to press for those conditions for free and fair elections and press for the conditions, the necessary preconditions for holding the referendum on time. If we don't hold that referendum on, if the referendum is not held on time in January 2011, that's probably the most certain trigger for a return to full-scale national war. Now, to be clear, we're not demanding a postponement of the election per se, but what we're doing here, and there's a reason for it, is pushing for the conditions for a free and fair election as spelled out by the CPA. In other words, total adherence to the CPA, not selective adherence to the CPA. If the international community lets then the National Congress Party just gloss over the provisions that would create a fair election without any consequences, this will demonstrate, and this is the crucial point, this will demonstrate once again that we, the international community, lack the will to enforce the basic elements of the CPA. And what does that do? That signals to the CPA that it can wriggle out of further CPA requirements going down the road, which further imperils the fragile peace that exists today in the South. So that's why we're calling for the full implementation of the CPA. And we think rushing towards elections, which are 5 months away, without the proper conditions in place will end badly, particularly for the people of the South and the people of Darfur, and it will further embolden, this is the punchline, it'll further embolden the National Congress Party to undermine the next major CPA process, which is the referendum. So we have to hold the line here. It's not a future benchmark we're looking at, it's a present one. But there's an even more important point from our perspective at the Enough Project. There is a reason Sudan is facing this 10 minutes till midnight make or break scenario that we're facing today. Until now, and this is for me the most important point the advocacy community can make, because there's been no cost for not implementation of key parts of the CPA, because there's been no cost for the commission of genocide, because there's been no cost for the commission of another genocide in the South, which wasn't called a genocide for 20 years, the parties, but particularly the National Congress Party, continue to trample on any agreement that is signed because there is no consequence for non-implementation. It's very obvious in basic human nature. So it's time, and this is why the Congress is so crucial, it's time for President Obama to decide to implement his own administration's benchmark-based policy. Because flouting the establishment of conditions for a credible election and the referendum, that should trigger immediate consequences now. The U.S. should work within the United Nations Security Council and outside of it, because a lot of things are simply not going to be able to move, as we all know, because of the membership there. And we should work to build that coalition of countries that are willing to introduce some of these consequences. Sometimes we'll have to go it alone, but let's at least do the diplomatic work to build the coalition to try to go multilaterally on some of these things and impose these consequences as soon as possible on the National Congress Party for its obstruction of basic conditions for peace. And the consequences, everyone always says, oh, we already tried pressure. This is what General Gratian has said a number of times publicly. We've tried pressure, it doesn't work. We haven't. We haven't tried credible pressures, and we list a few here. And they're incredibly important, valuable points that Mr. Karish has raised in the panel of experts report about the effectiveness of sanctions when they're actually implemented and the ineffective sanctions when you pass them, but then you don't implement them and don't execute them. So first and foremost, we need to ratchet up and actually impose some of the targeted sanctions on the people listed in that confidential annex, and do it in a sequential way so people can see the tidal wave is coming at their head. So they can see you're working up through the chain of command on the basis of empirical evidence that these people are either obstructing implementation of agreements or actually responsible for grave human rights abuses. So we can do those multilateral sanctions, the travel bans and asset freezes. They're scarlet letters. They're political impacts for economic measures. Secondly, we can deny multilateral debt relief. The Sudanese government is on a mission right now. They want debt relief. They've got a serious economic problem. Even though they're making money hand over fist from the oil, they're going into private accounts. So publicly, the coffers are bare. They need multilateral debt relief. We need to be in every forum they're in asking for debt relief, saying, sorry, not today. Third, we can be pushing for enforcement of this arms embargo that has been talked about, and I'll just refer you back to the previous testimony. And then fourth, we can provide, as the United States, now that the conclusion of the process, the interagency process of examining what the Obama administration's policy should be towards the International Criminal Court is finished, we ought to be providing more robust support for the ICC investigations and indictments for ongoing atrocities. And all that wordsmithing that was going on there about whether genocide is occurring or not in Darfur obscures the fact, just because 16 or 18 people, according to General Gratian, died in Darfur, or whatever month he was referring to, let's count the number, but we can't because we have no access. Let's count the number of women who have been raped. Let's count the number of children who are malnourished directly as a result of policies that are aimed at destroying in whole or in part a particular group of people. Call it genocide or don't call it genocide, it doesn't just mean gas chambers or village burning. Genocide has many different forms. Let's look at that. Now, these consequences in this confidential annex that General Gratian says doesn't exist, which concerns me greatly, these are the instruments, if we are to believe Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Rice in their elaboration of this confidential annex, these are the consequences and the instruments that I think can help prevent an all-out war in Sudan. In conclusion, then, in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, you said you made a very important point about engagement. When we're talking about increasing consequences, we're not talking about cutting off negotiations, engagement. You have to engage to get your priorities advanced. But you use the consequences to back up and give leverage to the engagement. And we think, not to leave Darfur out of the equation here, we think it's time for a real diplomatic surge in Darfur. Let's not forget Darfur as we become obsessed with our efforts to try to prevent a return of the North-South war. And we think a surge, a diplomatic surge by the United States and its allies on Darfur should include the immediate drafting of a proposal, a peace proposal that addresses the root cause in Sudan, and put that draft down and start the debate and the dialogue between the Darfurians and amongst the broader Sudanese public about what the basic elements of a peace agreement will look like in Darfur. After 6 years of this nightmare for the people of Darfur, we have yet to have seen one document laid down by the United States and the broader international community that addresses the core issues that every Darfuri knows, lives, and breathes. It is a stunning failure of international diplomacy. There is nothing preventing us from going to Bachelet, the United Nations African Union representative, working with him to put the draft together. How many consultations more does one need to say these are the basic issues? Put those positions down and get people negotiating over an actual text. That'll move the ball forward. Thanks very much for having me, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This ends the hearing phase, and we will now move into the briefing. And we will now hear from Lieutenant General Neal. Neal, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, I thank you very much for having afforded me this opportunity on behalf of my organization, the SPLM, and the government of Southern Sudan, of which I'm a member. to make a few remarks in relation to the current state of play with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, and I'll end by also making a few remarks on some of the governance challenges that face the government of Southern Sudan. On the issue of implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, there are serious challenges on the security front. As you might well be aware, the JIUs, the Sudan Armed Forces component of the JIU, is being used to destabilize the government of Southern Sudan. The National Congress Party basically decided to integrate its former militias into the Sudan Armed Forces as a first step to putting them on the joint integrated units. They are deployed in Southern Sudan, and the joint integrated units that are deployed in Upper Nile in particular have caused a lot of problems, and there has been considerable loss of life on 2 occasions in the vicinity of Malakal. We have raised the issue in the Joint Defense Board, which is the body that provides the command for the joint integrated units. We have suggested that these forces be relocated outside the area. At first they agreed, and then they went back on that agreement and then decided that these forces would stay put. We think that this is a serious destabilizing element, in addition, of course, to the flow of arms that has been spoken about into Southern Sudan. On that score, we lack the capacity to deal effectively as far as our police force is concerned, but the SPLA has stepped in to lend a helping hand to the police forces, and we have launched a campaign to collect the arms in the hands of the civil population, because the proliferation of arms in the hands of the civil population is primarily the reason for the escalation in the conflict. These conflicts have traditionally been there in Southern Sudan between the different ethnic groups. These conflicts occur over grazing, over access to resources, but now they've been given a political dimension by the National Congress Party, which seeks to exploit them for political advantage. So we have had some success in the collection of these arms, and this process is going to continue. But we do not think that's a panacea for the problem, because as long as there is a source from which these arms continuously pour into Southern Sudan, and we cannot plug the source of those arms, we'll have to put in place mechanisms to constantly mop up the arms from the supply. The issue of the Loss Resistance Army has been talked about at length. We have always suspected the linkage between the Loss Resistance Army and the National Congress Party, but it's clear now that evidence is coming to light establishing that link. And the Loss Resistance Army has scaled up its activities quite considerably. It has actually gone regional now. It's wreaking havoc not only in Southern Sudan, but in the DR Congo, in the Central African Republic. And we have been calling for concerted regional action to address the menace of the LRA. It is clear that the National Congress Party is not only has it failed to live up to its obligations, because according to the CPA and the interim constitution of 2005, both the SPLA and the South Sudan Armed Forces are duty-bound to act together to make sure that there is no foreign armed presence on Sudanese soil. So not only have they failed to do that, but apparently we are now getting proof of their complicity in LRA atrocities. Another area I would like to speak briefly about is the area of wealth sharing. There is considerable lack of transparency and accountability in the oil sector. Actually, the mandate of the National Petroleum Commission, that is the mandate that was given to the NPC by the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, has been practically usurped by the Ministry of Energy and Mining. The government of Southern Sudan only gets to receive what is claimed to be 50% of its share of the oil money, but how these sums are arrived at, we have no idea. You recall the recent report by Global Witness, which basically says that perhaps Southern Sudan has lost out on close to $600 million of its oil revenue just over a 2-year period. Another issue is the restructuring of the central bank in Sudan, so that the Bank of Southern Sudan operates the conventional window rather than being just a mere branch or an appendage of the Central Bank of Sudan. Another serious issue that we have to contend with is the practice by Khartoum to transfer our share of the oil money in local currency, as if actually those who import our oil pay for it in Sudanese currency. These are issues that we have raised time and again in the context of the trilateral discussions that are being led by General Gratian. He has promised that he would address these issues, but apparently there's no progress, and we do not know the problems that are confronting him in terms of access to the National Congress Party. For instance, there was an agreement in the trilateral talks that the United States, together with the IMF, would look into this particular issue and make sure that the provision of the CPA that would make the Bank of Southern Sudan operate the conventional window rather than it just being an appendage of the Central Bank of Sudan would be addressed. We know that a lot of the general attention has been taken up by critically important issues, the elections and the census, as well as the referendum bill. These are very important issues. But nonetheless, we think some of these issues are important as well. Some of the wealth sharing provisions that are yet to be implemented, in addition to the issues of the demarcation on the ground of the Abyei border and the border, the north-south border. On the process of democratic transformation, preparations are ongoing for the forthcoming elections scheduled for April. There are definitely a lot of challenges. It's clear that the National Election Commission has been overshadowed by the National Congress Party, and it looks as if it's the National Congress Party that is actually running the show, at least in northern Sudan, in terms of the preparations for the elections. So we seriously doubt whether the elections, at least in the north, are really going to be free and fair. The National Election Commission has serious shortages of personnel. I mean, I just came from my own constituency, and there are very, very few enumerators. The few that are working do not have means of mobility. They are handicapped in every way possible, and yet they are expected to deliver results. And we do not believe for a second that the National Congress Party does not have the resources, you see, to fund the preparations for the elections. Our relationship with the different political forces, including the National Congress Party, are really not founded on predilections, on dislikes or dislikes. There is nothing we have against the National Congress Party, but they are based on shared political interest, on the convergence of political interests. The rest of Sudan's political forces obviously want democratic transformation to take place, if for no other reason other than the fact that it's their key to political power. We also want the democratic transformation to take place because the elections are called for by the CPA and by the Constitution. Perhaps the National Congress Party wants to preserve the status quo. We still do not have any quarrel with that as well. They can preserve the status quo as long as they do it through the CPA and through the Constitution. If they can win the hearts and minds of the Sudanese people to be given a fresh mandate to rule, so be it. But to frustrate the process is simply not acceptable. And if we decide to work in conjunction with the rest of the political forces to eliminate the obstacles to free and fair elections, that does not in any way mean that we are against the National Congress Party. As a matter of fact, the task of the special envoy has been made extremely difficult by the National Congress Party. Although earlier on there were some achievements, I think during the last few weeks, no tangible results have been achieved. And that is because the National Congress Party has decided to introduce extraneous issues into the debate. For instance, they are demanding that in order to review the census results and allocate additional seats to the South to compensate the South for the losses as a result of a flawed census process, they would want the SPLM to forge a political partnership, a strategic political partnership with the National Congress Party. We already have a partnership with the National Congress Party to implement the CPA. Even these issues we are unable to address. So we don't see how the National Congress Party envisages a superior, a higher level of political partnership, because if at all there are commonalities between the SPLM and the National Congress Party, then we are to be educated by the National Congress Party. Let them show these commonalities to us. But to try to say that we will give you additional seats in return for you accepting to be our political partners is not acceptable, because the two issues are simply not related. On the other hand, if the process of the census was not fundamentally flawed, then why would the National Congress Party want to trade the census results in return for a political partnership? It clearly suggests that there is a problem with the census process. There are two issues, Mr. Chairman, that are of critical importance, and we believe that they should receive the attention that they deserve. The issue of the demarcation of the RBI boundaries on the ground. The PCA award was endorsed by the presidency, and instructions were issued by the presidency to form a technical committee to effect the demarcation of the RBI boundaries on the ground. Unfortunately, this has not taken place because the National Congress Party and its affiliated militia are issuing threats and intimidating people. So it looks as if what the presidency or what President Omar al-Bashir has given with one hand, he's taking back with the other, and that's a matter of serious concern. The other issue, of course, is the north-south boundary, of which the National Congress Party is dragging its feet. Any number of issues that remain unresolved in the CPA, Mr. Chairman, can trigger a return to war. But perhaps the two most potent are the RBI boundaries and the north-south border. These two issues need special attention, and we would like to see General Gratian, in addition to his efforts to gain traction on the issue of the census and elections and the referendum law, also to pay more attention to these two issues. On the areas of southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, Mr. Chairman, there is a fundamental divergence of opinion on this issue between the SPLM and the National Congress Party. We accept that it is the legislatures in these two areas that will handle the matter. But at the same time, we think that the process is so politically significant that it has to be governed by a legal framework. Now, the National Congress Party wants to reduce the exercise to a purely local matter to be decided by the people of southern Kordofan state and the people of southern Blue Nile by themselves. And we think that should not be the case, because when these people engage in the process of popular consultation, they are going obviously to evaluate, to make an assessment of the political arrangements that they have, and they may express dissatisfaction with the current arrangements and demand even more political concession from the center. That's not an issue only for the people of southern Blue Nile and the people of southern Kordofan. It's an issue for other people in Sudan as well, especially for the people in Darfur. So it's politically a weighty issue and should not be swept under the carpet in the manner that the National Congress Party seeks to address it. On the issue of ABI, I've already mentioned the situation there. It certainly needs more attention. On the Darfur conflict, we believe that the SPLM, not only the SPLM, but other political forces in Sudan should really be involved in the quest for peace in Darfur. It should not just be left to the National Congress Party alone. These days, the National Congress Party is trying to deflect attention away from Darfur by claiming that the prospect of the South seceding would be such a serious development, which would lead to Southerners basically massacring each other, that we should focus on that and leave Darfur alone. At least for the CPA, there is a blueprint, there is a roadmap. But in Darfur, we are still nowhere, you know. And the National Congress Party should be made to fulfill its obligations both towards Darfur as well as towards the CPA. This, Mr. Chairman, is extremely important, but we think that the SPLM can bring value, can add value to the process of quest for peace in Darfur, and we have demonstrated that in the past. We have got a Darfur task force, which has now been even further reinforced by the SPLM leadership, and at least we are on talking terms with all the Darfuri movements. In the past, we have been able to make some of them close their ranks and come together. So we have a role to play, and the National Congress Party is of the opinion that it's their show. Unfortunately, some segments within the international community believe that the SPLM should limit its attention to the South. But we are still part and parcel of Sudan, and we are a key player still on the Sudanese political scene. If the process of registration for elections in the north is anything to go by, you'll understand that a lot of people have turned out to register because they have been mobilized by the SPLM to do that. So our role, our contribution to national processes should not be underrated. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take this opportunity also maybe to digress a little to some of issues that relate to governance in Southern Sudan. There is no denying the fact that there are serious governance challenges that face the government of Southern Sudan. First and foremost, Southern Sudan is an area that has been embroiled in conflict for 40 of the 50 years that Sudan has been independent. So we have had very, very little time to establish the institutions of governance. So the mere fact that we have a semblance of a functioning government in Southern Sudan is to our mind an achievement in itself. Right now in Southern Sudan, in our counties and in our payams, and these are the local government structures, we do not have clans or ethnic groups that are basically running these payams and counties as they please. In fact, if anything, there is a lot of complaints that we are receiving in Juba from the states, from the counties, and from the payams that their powers of raising money through taxes have been usurped by the central government in Juba. So there is no case of anarchy, of chaos in Southern Sudan that can justify Southern Sudan being described as a pre-failed state. Yes, there is fighting. Lives are being lost, but action is also being taken to address some of these challenges. As I mentioned, we have launched a disarmament campaign. We have done it in the past quite successfully. It has cost us lives. We have lost men in the SPLA, but we have no option other than to continue doing that until such time as when the capacity of our police force is raised to a level that can allow them to address these law and order problems. But for the time being, we find ourselves forced, despite the fact that we do not constitutionally have a law and order mandate, to intervene and address some of these law and order problems. Otherwise, the system would crumble. Much has been made about the loss of resources and economic resources in Southern Sudan are being lost either through outright corruption or through maladministration, which is the result of incompetence. But despite that, Mr. Chairman, if you go to Southern Sudan and you take a tour, especially for somebody who is familiar with the pre-CPA situation in Southern Sudan, you realize that for the first time in a while we have a road network. I mean, it's not paved, but many of the centers in Southern Sudan are now connected, and you can move quite conveniently during the dry season. So we feel that something has been accomplished in that area. Still much remains to be done because Southern Sudan is moving from an extremely low economic base. I would even say that there is no economic base from which we are moving to begin with because we have not had governance. There is no economic activity in Southern Sudan to speak of. As a matter of fact, some of the difficulties we are facing in terms of service delivery, the inadequacy of our effort in delivering services is primarily the result of the fact that there is no private sector in Southern Sudan. What is happening is that the government of Southern Sudan basically uses the oil revenue to sustain livelihoods. As a matter of fact, the government of Southern Sudan, as I speak, is really responsible for the livelihoods of almost all the home states in southern Sudan, because the private sector and its economic conventional wisdom nowadays that it's the private sector that is the driving engine of their economy. So without the private sector, we have to do the job. Our workforce is bloated. Our army is oversized. Why? Because the army is the only employer in southern Sudan. This is the primary reason why we have not done as was to be expected in the domain of service delivery. On a broader level, in terms of governance, our traditional institutions continue to be involved. This is part of the legacy of colonial rule, because when the colonial authorities came to Sudan, they used the existent structures, the local structures, to run the administration through an indirect system of rule. And this system has worked, and we have decided to maintain it. So we have been involving the traditional political authorities in matters that affect their daily life. And recently we had a conference of kings, chiefs, and other traditional leaders in Unity State in Bentiu that took a number of very, very important decisions, including supporting the government of Southern Sudan in its endeavor to effect the disarmament of the civil population, because the civil population has realized that the proliferation of arms is causing loss of lives on a scale that cannot be tolerated. We have also involved political parties all across the country in dialogue in Juba, and we feel that some of the issues that have been provided for in the CPA, and in particular the process of democratic transformation, is important. And if the NCP has, for its own reason, decided to abdicate its responsibility, then it's for the SPLM to take up that responsibility. And so we went ahead and invited these political forces to Juba to come and deliberate on the process of democratic transformation. And even as I speak, discussions are still ongoing between the different political parties precisely on whether to have elections or not. On our part as SPLM, we are preparing for the elections. We know that there are obstacles to the elections that need to be removed. One of the key obstacles that causes us a sleepless night is the question of the national security law, because that law allows arbitrary detention. And with that law in hand, with the NCP armed with that law, what they will do, they will go and identify candidates from the other political parties that are formidable and that could pose a challenge to their own candidate, and just grab them off the streets and throw them behind bars. And when the elections are over, they will be released. So we are cognizant of the fact that there are very, very serious obstacles to the elections, free and fair elections in Sudan. But all the same, we do not want to be caught unprepared. We have gone ahead and prepared ourselves for the elections. We have serious doubts as to whether the elections, if they take place, will be free and fair at all in the north. We strongly feel that they will be reasonably fair, free and fair in southern Sudan. And if you look at the statistics connected with the registration of voters in the south, they are quite impressive given the difficulties that we have. I mean, Bentiu, Unity State, is the leading state right now, not only in the south, but in the whole of Sudan in voter registration. Does that sound like a situation that can be categorized as a pre-failed state? Not at all, Mr. Chairman. So these are some of the challenges. On the issue of corruption, again, in southern Sudan, the elites have suddenly found themselves, with a lot of petrodollars, and people are finding it difficult to resist the temptation to dip their hands into some of the money. That is something that is to be expected. That's not the issue. The issue is whether people are resolved to do something about it. And I would like to take this opportunity to state here that even as we speak, there is a lively debate going on. That debate is taking place at the level of the Council of Ministers of the Government of Southern Sudan, as well as in the political bureau of the SPLM. That's the highest decision-making body of the SPLM. And what is being debated is whether we should take some of the prosecutorial powers to prosecute, from the hands of the Ministry of Legal Affairs and Constitutional Development, and give them to the Anti-Corruption Authority. This view is gaining currency. In addition to the fact that the President of the government of Southern Sudan has time and again been on record stating very clearly that corruption is not going to be tolerated. So we may not have moved much, but I want you to know that it's an issue of concern, and people are beginning to exchange views on how to actually address the scourge of corruption in Southern Sudan. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we would like really to urge the government of the United States, through the Office of the Special Envoy, to give a little bit more attention to some of the issues that have been foreshadowed by the census, the elections, the referendum issue. Why? Because these issues have a bearing on the state of relations between the SPLM and the NCP. When I know that the Central Bank of Sudan will only give me my share of oil receipts in local currency, such that I'm not able to trade with the neighboring countries, such that I am entirely economically dependent on the North, then that creates a very serious problem of mutual confidence. And when mutual confidence breaks down, Mr. Chairman, there will be no progress. So because of this, I think these issues deserve as much attention from the Special Envoy as the other issues that relate to the elections, the census, and the referendum. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me just say that a lot has been made of the fact that Southern Sudan, given the problems of the perceived problems of mismanagement, of corruption, of breakdown of security, law and order, is going to be a failed state. Now, Mr. Chairman, the reason why the NCP is making such a noise about it, and the reason why the NCP has gone out to lobby the international community behind this position, is simply because the NCP dreads the prospect of the South becoming an independent state. It may not be desirable for the South to become an independent state, but that's a different issue altogether. It's not connected with the inability of Southern Sudan to run its affairs in a peaceful manner. So we do not want the will of the people of Southern Sudan to be frustrated. What we want to happen, there should be a referendum as per the CPA, and the people of Southern Sudan should freely express their choice and their options in that referendum. So we really do not want these new issues to steal the limelight, because it is beginning to gain currency in the international community that, perhaps it's not a good idea to have the South become an independent state. We have made it very clear that we have no reservations at all about discussing post-referendum arrangements, but to link post-referendum issues with the passage of the referendum law as a procedural law is uncalled for. We have made it very clear to the Special Envoy, to the National Congress Party, that let us go ahead and pass the referendum law, and then let us sit down in any forum in accordance with any format that may be mutually agreed to discuss post-referendum arrangements. I am sure if we want to maintain peace and stability in Sudan, whether as a united country or to have two neighbors that are living in peace and harmony with one another, then we have to agree on these things. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity.
Let me thank you very much, and let me thank all of you. We have another series of votes. I wonder if the ranking member wanted to make any concluding remarks. I intend to come back for a few minutes to ask several questions if the panel will indulge. We have 3 to 4 votes. They're 5-minute votes each. Normally it should be 20 minutes for the duration of the votes. So at that time, we'll...
Mr. Chairman, well, I have several questions
Okay.
that I'll reduce to just a few, but I hope our panelists, I know they will, hopefully will understand.
Okay, great. You, okay. Great. Well, we'll recess. We'll probably re-adjourn at about 2. We have to be out of this room at 2:30 anyway, so we'll be evicted if we're not finished. Meeting stands in recess.